I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, where life was quiet, simple, and predictable. My family wasn't wealthy, but we had enough to get by. My parents were hardworking people, and I admired them deeply. From a young age, I learned the value of perseverance. We lived in a modest home, but there was love in every corner of it. My father worked as a carpenter, and my mother managed the household with grace and efficiency. They were my first teachers, showing me what it meant to work hard, to sacrifice, and to never give up, no matter how difficult life might seem. Even as a child, I had big dreams. I looked at the world around me and imagined myself achieving great things. I wanted to do something that would make me proud, something that would make a difference in my life and in the lives of those around me. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew it had to be something meaningful. By the time I was 26, I was working as a construction worker. It was a tough job, but it was the kind of work that kept my hands busy and my mind focused. I loved the feeling of accomplishment at the end of each day, seeing the buildings rise from the ground. It felt like I was contributing to something bigger than myself. I was determined to climb higher, to work my way up, and perhaps one day, own my own construction company. But life, as it often does, had other plans for me. One fateful day, while I was working on the third floor of a building, something went horribly wrong. A section of scaffolding gave way beneath me, and I found myself plummeting to the ground. The world seemed to slow down in those moments as I fell. I could hear the gasps of my colleagues, but everything was muffled, like I was underwater. The impact was like nothing I had ever experienced. Pain shot through my body, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. My body felt like it belonged to someone else. Heavy and unresponsive. I couldn't move my legs, and I felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The doctors told me I had suffered multiple fractures and injuries, and that I would never walk again without assistance. I was devastated. All my dreams, my ambitions, everything I had worked so hard for, seemed to slip through my fingers in that single moment. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the emotional toll. I felt like a failure. I had always prided myself on my strength, on my ability to push through hardship. But now I was left vulnerable, dependent on others. It was humiliating. And to make matters worse, the support I had expected from my friends and family began to dwindle. People who I thought would always be there for me started to pull away. The isolation was crushing. It was in the midst of this overwhelming darkness that I experienced a small miracle. Though at the time, it didn't seem like one. It was a cold afternoon, and I was sitting alone outside, trying to clear my head. The hospital had become my prison, and I longed for something, anything, to remind me that life still held meaning. As I sat there, I noticed something unusual, a small wicker basket on the ground near the street. Curious, I wheeled myself over to it and opened the lid. Inside was a baby, wrapped in a thin blanket, her tiny face pink from the cold. She couldn't have been more than a few days old. My heart skipped a beat as I stared down at her, completely bewildered. Who would leave such a precious child here, all alone? I glanced around, but the street was empty. I felt an overwhelming urge to take the baby in my arms, to protect her. I had no idea who she was or why she had been abandoned. But I knew I couldn't leave her there, vulnerable and alone. With great effort, I carefully lifted her from the basket, and her small fingers wrapped around mine. She made a soft, cooing sound, and my heart melted. I knew right then and there that my life had changed forever. I was no longer just a man struggling with his own pain. I had a new purpose, a new responsibility. I took her inside and immediately alerted the hospital staff. After making sure the baby was taken care of, I was informed that they would start the process of finding her a proper home. But something inside me refused to let her go. I had no family, no one to turn to. And in that moment, I realized that this baby could be my chance for redemption. My chance to give love and care to someone who needed it as much as I did. I named her Luke. I don't know why that name came to me, but it felt right. I promised her that no matter what, I would always be there for her. That I would protect her, love her, and guide her through life. The doctors thought I was mad, but I didn't care. I knew I had to try. In the days that followed, I faced an overwhelming amount of paperwork and bureaucratic hurdles. It wasn't easy, but I was determined. With every step, I learned to care for Luke, feeding her, changing her diapers, and rocking her to sleep. As I held her in my arms, I realized that I was no longer alone. My life had found new meaning, and the pain and darkness that had consumed me for so long began to fade, replaced by the warmth of this little soul. In that moment, I made a promise to myself. I would not let the circumstances of my life define me. I would not be broken by my past or my injuries. I would rise again. Not for myself, but for Luke. I would give her the love and care that I had always longed for. And in doing so, I would find the strength to live again. And so, our journey began. Just the two of us, facing the world together. Little did I know then, that our bond would be tested in ways I could never have imagined. But for that brief, shining moment, I knew one thing with certainty: love had come into my life when I needed it most. And it would be the force that carried me forward. The days following Luke's arrival were a whirlwind of emotions. With each passing day, I learned more about what it meant to be a parent. I had no prior experience, and the hospital staff initially looked at me with skepticism. How could a man, already battling his own demons, take on the responsibility of raising a child? But there was something in the way Luke looked at me with her wide, innocent eyes that told me I was meant to care for her. I didn't have all the answers, but I had an immense desire to give her the love she deserved. I remember the first time I fed her. My hands shook as I carefully prepared the bottle, unsure of how to hold it or what temperature it should be. But when Luke took that first sip, her eyes closed in satisfaction, and I felt a sense of pride surge within me. It wasn't about the physical ability to move freely or the success of climbing career ladders anymore. It was about this tiny human being trusting me to keep her safe and provide for her. In that moment, I understood what true responsibility meant. But with this newfound purpose came a host of challenges. Raising a child with my limited resources and physical limitations was not easy. I had to rely on the assistance of others at times, especially when Luke was a newborn and required more attention than I could give alone. I learned to balance my days between managing my own rehabilitation, taking care of Luke, and figuring out how to make a living. I found myself turning to online freelance work, doing small projects from home to make ends meet. It wasn't glamorous, but it allowed me to stay home with Luke, and that mattered most. At the same time, I couldn't escape the dark shadows of my past. My injury had not only physically altered my life but emotionally scarred me as well. The feeling of inadequacy, the thought that I would never be whole again, still haunted me. Some nights, I would lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, asking myself how I would manage to give Luke a life full of love and opportunities when I couldn't even take care of myself properly. The fear of failing her weighed heavily on my heart. There were moments when I doubted my ability to be the father she deserved. The pressure of providing, of healing from my own trauma, and of managing the expectations I placed on myself, at times felt like a crushing burden. But every time I saw Luke's smiling face, or heard her giggle when I made a silly face, I found the strength to keep going. She was my anchor in a stormy sea. I remember the first time she said my name. It was so simple, so pure. But hearing that little voice, Dada, filled me with an indescribable joy. It was like she was speaking straight to my soul. I held her in my arms, and it felt as though time had stopped. For that fleeting moment, the doubts, the fear, and the pain all faded away. All that mattered was that we had each other. despite the small victories and moments of joy. There were days when I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. The loneliness crept in like an unwelcome visitor. I found myself longing for the support I had once taken for granted. The company of friends and family who had slowly faded away after my accident. It was hard to admit that people who had been a part of my life no longer seemed to care. I had isolated myself in many ways. Too ashamed of my injuries to reach out. Yet, in some strange way, I understood. People don't always know how to respond to tragedy. They don't always know how to be there for someone when their life has dramatically shifted. The only person I could rely on now was Luke. And that made the silence around me bearable. I made sure to create small routines with her that we both looked forward to. Every evening, we would sit together by the window, watching the sunset as she rested her tiny head on my shoulder. I whispered stories to her. My words filled with hope for her future. Dreams of a world where she could achieve anything. In her innocent eyes, I saw a future far brighter than my own. It was a future that, for once, didn't feel out of reach. But the reality of life wasn't always so gentle. As Luke grew, so did the challenges. I had to figure out how to balance raising her with the demands of my own healing process. My body wasn't the same, and sometimes, even the smallest task would feel overwhelming. But I knew I had to keep pushing forward. I couldn't let her see me falter, not when she was looking at me with such trust. And so, day by day, we kept moving forward together. There were moments of triumph and moments of struggle. But through it all, Luke taught me something invaluable, no matter the darkness. Love has the power to heal and bring light. The days weren't always easy, but they were always worth it. As I held her in my arms, I knew that every sacrifice, every tear, and every moment of doubt was shaping both our futures. We were no longer just two lost souls. We were a family, imperfect but strong in our bond. As Luke grew older, the challenges of being her sole caregiver became even more pronounced. She was a curious, energetic toddler, full of life and questions. Every day, she discovered something new, her mind constantly absorbing the world around her. And as she grew, I realized that I had to grow too, both as a father and as a man. One of the hardest lessons I had to learn was that I couldn't do it all by myself. In the beginning, I had convinced myself that asking for help was a sign of weakness. I thought that if I couldn't manage on my own, I would be letting Luke down. But as the weight of my responsibilities increased, so did the realization that I needed support. My pride, once so fiercely protective of my independence, had to be set aside. It wasn't easy, but little by little, I began to open up to the possibility of reconnecting with the world. I sought out therapy, not just to heal from the emotional wounds my accident had left, but to be a better father. I realized that Luke needed more than just a father who could provide for her physical needs. She needed an emotionally present parent who was willing to confront his own demons. The therapy sessions were difficult. Every time I spoke about my accident, the frustration and anger from the past would flood back. The image of that day, of the moment my life had changed forever, played on a loop in my mind. But it was in confronting that pain that I began to understand something profound about healing. It wasn't about forgetting the past, but about learning to live alongside it. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could change how I reacted to it. One breakthrough came when I realized that my injury didn't define me, it was simply part of my story. For a long time, I had viewed myself as broken, incomplete. I had told myself that because I wasn't the person I used to be, I was no longer worthy of love or success. But through therapy, I learned to stop seeing myself as the sum of my mistakes and my scars. Instead, I began to see myself as a man who had survived something unimaginable. And in that survival, I had found a new strength. As I worked through these personal hurdles, Luke continued to be my guiding light. Her laughter became a soundtrack for my recovery, and her curiosity sparked my own. There were times when I would find myself losing patience, when the weight of my own struggles made it hard to connect with her in the way she deserved. But Luke never judged me for my imperfections. She loved me simply for being there. Her unconditional love was both humbling and empowering. It was during one of those difficult moments, when I was at my lowest, that Luke reminded me of something I had forgotten: the power of hope. I was sitting on the couch, feeling overwhelmed, when she came running over to me, her tiny hands clutching a picture she had drawn. It was a simple drawing. Nothing extraordinary, just a picture of the two of us, holding hands. But in that moment, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. She smiled up at me, her eyes sparkling with pride. "Daddy," she said, "we're going to be okay. I know it." Tears welled up in my eyes as I took the drawing from her hands. It was a moment of pure connection. A reminder that even when I couldn't find the strength within myself, Luke believed in us. And that belief, her belief, gave me the courage to keep going. Slowly, I started to rebuild my life. I found a part-time job that allowed me to work from home, which gave me the flexibility to care for Luke and continue my therapy. It wasn't much, but it was a step forward. I learned to balance my time between providing for her, healing, and continuing to grow as a person. There were still days of frustration and doubt, but I found peace in the small victories, the moments when Luke ran to me with excitement, or when she looked at me with pure trust in her eyes. The future was still uncertain, and there were many obstacles ahead. But for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. I had come to understand that the road to healing wasn't linear. It wasn't about getting back to who I was before the accident, but about embracing who I was becoming. The man I was now, the father I was now, was enough. And with Luke by my side, I knew we could face anything together. I no longer viewed myself as broken. I saw myself as a man who had faced unimaginable challenges and emerged stronger for it. And I knew, deep in my heart, that no matter what the future held, we would always have each other. The days blended into months, and with each passing one, I found myself becoming more comfortable in my new role as both father and survivor. The anxiety that had once consumed me began to dissipate, replaced by a calm determination to make the best of the life I had left. It wasn't about erasing the pain of the past, but about accepting that it was a part of who I was, and that I had the power to shape my future despite it. I began to take on new challenges. Small steps at first, but they were steps nonetheless. I started pushing myself physically, attending rehabilitation sessions with more consistency. There were days when my body ached, when the progress seemed minimal, but I held on to the belief that any movement forward, no matter how slow, was still progress. My physical therapist, a woman named Sarah, became one of my most important sources of support. She wasn't just helping me regain strength, but she was also teaching me to be kind to myself. Healing takes time, she would remind me. Be patient with the process. Those words stuck with me. Patience had never been a strong suit of mine, but I had learned through my journey with Luke that the best things in life often require time. It wasn't just about pushing through the pain to get back to a version of myself I could never reclaim. It was about building a new self. One that was more resilient, more compassionate, and more connected to the world around me. Luke, too, was growing. Each day, she became a little more independent, a little more aware of the world beyond our home. I watched in awe as her imagination bloomed. She would create entire worlds out of blocks and dolls, often telling me the most elaborate stories that seemed to come from some magical place in her mind. She had an innocence that was infectious, and her love for life was a constant reminder to cherish every moment. But with her growth came the realization that she would eventually need more than I could give her on my own. She needed other role models, friends her own age, and mentors who could show her how to navigate a world that I, at times, struggled to understand myself. It was a painful but necessary realization. I could no longer shield her from the world. As much as I wanted to, the world would shape her, just as it had shaped me, and she would grow into the woman she was meant to be. no matter how much I tried to hold her back. One afternoon, as we sat in the park, I watched Luke play with a group of children. She was so different from the shy, quiet toddler I had first brought into the world. Now, she was the one initiating games, laughing with her friends, and running around without a care in the world. A pang of pride filled my chest as I watched her, but it was also accompanied by a quiet sadness. It was as if, in that moment, she was slipping further away from me, becoming her own person, with her own life and her own journey. I realized that I had to let go, just a little. I had to trust that I had done my best to raise her, that the lessons I had instilled in her, the values of kindness, resilience, and empathy, would guide her as she ventured out into the world. It was then that I had another revelation. Perhaps the key to our future wasn't about holding on so tightly, but about learning to let go. The idea terrified me, but in a strange way, it was liberating. To let go wasn't to give up, but to trust that Luke was strong enough to face the world on her own. And I too had to trust that I was strong enough to face the world without constantly looking back. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: I no longer had to navigate it alone. I had learned to ask for help when I needed it. I had learned that my strength wasn't in isolation but in connection. The past had shaped me, but it would no longer define me. What mattered now was how I chose to live in the present, how I chose to move forward. Luke and I were embarking on a new chapter, one that was full of hope, even if it was laced with a bit of fear. The future was ours to create, and I was ready to step into it. One day at a time. As the months continued to pass, the weight of my past seemed to lighten. I had made peace with the scars on my body and in my heart. Though I knew they would never fully fade, they had become a part of me, not as reminders of what I had lost, but as symbols of what I had gained: resilience, strength, an understanding of love's deepest form. But even more than that, the scars had taught me the beauty of healing, of starting over when life had torn you apart. Luke's world was growing faster than mine. She would come home from school, full of stories about her friends, her teachers, and the small adventures of a child's day. I loved hearing her talk, loved seeing her eyes light up as she told me about the latest happenings in her life. It wasn't just the words that mattered, but the way she spoke, so confident, so sure of herself, so unafraid of the future. I knew I had to let go, to allow her to keep growing. But there were times, especially in those quiet moments at night when we were curled up together on the couch, that I found myself wishing she could stay small, stay dependent on me forever. I wanted to protect her from the harsh realities of the world, to shield her from hurt. But I also knew that it wasn't my job to protect her from everything. It was my job to equip her with the tools to face the world, to help her build the resilience she would need to stand on her own. One evening, as we sat by the window, watching the sun set, Luke asked me a question that made my heart swell. "Dad, do you think I'll ever be as strong as you?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. I looked down at her, taking in the innocence in her expression, the genuine desire to understand. I smiled, my heart aching with love. "You already are, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You have a strength inside you that's more powerful than anything I could teach you. It's in your heart, in the way you love the world." She smiled, a small but knowing smile, and nestled closer to me. In that moment, I realized that my job as a father wasn't to mold her into something I thought she should be. It was to support her in becoming the person she was always meant to be. It was around this time that I began to think about my own future, not just in terms of being a father, but as a person. I had spent so long living in the shadow of my past, of my trauma, that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to dream about my own life. But now, I found myself wondering what was next for me. What would I do with the rest of my years? I began taking small steps toward this new chapter, applying for jobs, reconnecting with old friends, and slowly re-entering the world I had once withdrawn from. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like I had lost the ability to connect, to put myself out there, but each small victory felt like a triumph. It was as though I was rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried beneath the weight of grief and fear. I had been so focused on surviving that I had forgotten how to live. Through this journey, I learned that it was okay to take risks, to open myself up to the possibility of disappointment or failure. After all, it was through the hardest moments of my life that I had learned what truly mattered. The love I shared with Luke, the strength we found together, the lessons we taught each other, it was all more important than any job title, any material success. And yet, there was still so much to explore. The future held promise. Even if I couldn't see it clearly yet, there were dreams I had put on hold, places I had yet to visit, relationships I had yet to build. I no longer saw the future as something to fear, but as a canvas waiting to be painted with the colors of hope and possibility. The journey was far from over, but I was no longer afraid to face it. I had come to understand that life would never be perfect, but it would always be worth living, as long as I kept moving forward, one day at a time. Luke, too, was moving forward. As she grew, so did our bond. It wasn't just about me taking care of her anymore, it was about us growing together, learning from each other, and creating a life that was full of love, laughter, and meaning. In the end, I realized that the future wasn't something to be feared, it was something to be embraced. The pain of the past would always be there, but it no longer had the power to control me. What mattered now was the present. The moments I shared with my daughter, and the lessons we learned together. The future was ours to create, and we were ready to face it together. As I sat back and reflected on the journey that had brought me here, I realized that the most profound lessons weren't just about survival, they were about transformation. Life had unfolded in ways I hadn't anticipated, shaping me, shaping Luke, in ways I could never have imagined. There was a quiet wisdom in those moments of struggle, a lesson that only time could teach us. Luke was sitting next to me, her legs crossed, her eyes focused on the book in her lap, but I could tell she was deep in thought. She had always been observant. Even when she was younger, she had inherited that quiet understanding of the world that I had once thought was beyond her years. "Dad," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence, "do you think we'll ever stop learning from each other?" I looked at her, startled by the depth of her question. It was one of those moments where I realized how much she had grown, how much she had come to understand not just about the world, but about us. "I don't think we ever stop learning from each other," I replied, smiling gently. "I think we just find new ways to understand things as we grow. Life keeps teaching us lessons, but the most important ones come when we open ourselves to them, when we're willing to listen." She nodded, her gaze returning to the book. Though her mind was far away, I could tell she was thinking about more than just the words on the page. Underscore 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 underscore. In the days that followed, Luke's question echoed in my mind. What was it that I had learned? What had I really taken away from everything we had gone through? As I pieced the lessons together, I realized that the most important things I had learned were simple but profound. The first lesson was that healing takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. And it's never linear. There are days when you feel like you're making progress, and there are days when it feels like everything has come crashing down again. But through it all, the key is persistence. We must allow ourselves to feel the pain, to sit with it, and then to move through it. We can't rush the process, but we can trust that the healing will come, bit by bit. The second lesson was the importance of love real. Unconditional love. When I first became a father, I had no idea what that would look like. But now, after everything, I saw it for what it truly was. Love wasn't always grand gestures or perfect moments. Sometimes, it was the small things, a shared laugh, a hand to hold, a moment of silence when words weren't needed. Love was a constant presence, even in the darkest times, and it was the love between Luke and me that had kept me going, had shown me that there was always something worth fighting for. And then there was the lesson of letting go. This one was the hardest. As a parent, it's easy to think that your job is to protect your child from the world, to keep them safe from all harm. But I had learned that part of loving someone is allowing them the freedom to grow, to face their own challenges, and to learn from their own mistakes. It was hard to let go, to let Luke step into the world on her own. But I had to trust her. Trust that she had the strength to face whatever came her way. And in doing so, I learned to trust myself. 2. Luke had her own lessons to draw from the story, ones that spoke directly to her growing heart and mind. She had learned the power of resilience. She had witnessed firsthand how we can survive, even thrive, after life knocks us down. She saw that strength wasn't about never feeling pain, it was about getting back up. Even when it seems impossible. It was about understanding that life was full of highs and lows. But the key was to keep moving forward. She had also learned the value of empathy. As a young girl, she had already learned to feel deeply, to understand others' emotions, and to act with kindness. It was something I had always admired about her, her ability to care so deeply for others, to offer a hand to someone in need without hesitation. She understood, even at her age, that the most meaningful connections we make in life are the ones where we see each other's pain and offer comfort, where we meet one another with understanding and love. Finally, she had learned the importance of embracing her own story. She had seen me struggle with my past, with the parts of myself that I tried to bury. But she had also seen how I had learned to embrace those parts of me, to make peace with them. She understood that no one is perfect, that everyone has their own battles to fight, and she had learned that it's okay to be vulnerable, to be imperfect, because it's those very imperfections that make us who we are. As I looked at Luke, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun, I realized that we were both different people than we had been when this journey began. The lessons we had learned were not just about survival, not just about healing, they were about living, truly living, in a world that can be both beautiful and painful. Dad, Luke said again, breaking my reverie, I'm glad we went through everything we did. I smiled, my heart full. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. And in that moment, I understood that while life had changed us, it had also given us a deeper understanding of love, of strength, and of what it truly means to live with purpose. Together, we had learned the most important lesson of all, that we were stronger than we ever thought possible, and that the future was ours to shape. The journey was not over, but it was one we would face together, hand in hand.